based on the popular and inaccurate story that is told, which is that Americans are comprised of only being white and the United States was settled by European immigrants. Race has functioned as a metaphor necessary to the construction of Americanness. In the creation of our national identity, American has been defined as white. Not to be white is to be designated as the other, different, inferior, and unassimilable. According to Takaki, this inaccurate story is deeply embedded in our mainstream culture and can be found in preeminent historians. Oppression is deeply felt among people of color and has been so for many years. A brief history of oppression consists of African Americans having been the central minority in this country. In 1676, English settlers primarily targeted Africa for their means of labor supply. African Americans were enslaved, and thereafter the African population increased and slavery spread across the South. They were degraded as unpaid laborers and were dehumanized as property to English settlers until the Civil War. As for Asian Americans, they had begun arriving to this country before European immigrants. They were seeking Gold Mountain, as the Chinese were among the 49ers. They worked in railroads and agricultural fields in West Coast states and in California and Massachusetts factories. English settlers viewed them as strangers that were coming from a different shore. As a result, they were stereotyped as heathen and were unwelcome. The Chinese were wanted by English colonizers only to stay as temporary laborers, as they were not welcomed as settlers. The passing of laws by the Congress, such as the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, is the first law that prohibited the entry of immigrants on the basis of nationality. The Japanese had also a painful experience. Despite their accomplishments in the U.S., it did not lead to their acceptance. During World War II, the government had interned 120,000 Japanese Americans, which 2/3 of them were citizens by birth. In 1975, after the collapse of Saigon, tens of thousands of refugees fled to this country from the Vietnam War. Early 17th century, Irish Americans came to this country, as many of them were brought to Virginia involuntarily, as captives of the English wars in Ireland and as indentured servants in the Irish slave trade. Moreover, during the 19th century, 4 million Irish emigrated to this country to escape hunger that was caused by the potato famine and by the rise of a ranching economy. As immigrants, they worked as construction workers, maids, and factory workers in textile mills of Lowell, Massachusetts. During this time, the Irish had come as a Catholic group seeking to settle. Yet because it was a Protestant society, they became victims of nativist hostility. Irish immigrants were viewed as ignorant and inferior. As a result, they were forced to obtain the lowest opportunities of employment. As they had gone to the South, they were forced to do the jobs that were considered too hazardous and dangerous to be done by slaves. In the North, competition developed among the Irish and Africans for jobs as waiters and longshoremen. They began to push Africans out of the labor market, as many Irish promoted their whiteness. This situation gave rise to the issue between Africans for jobs and thus causing more racial discrimination. However, the Irish were the only minority that obtained a distinct advantage, which was the Naturalization Law of 1790 that had reserved citizenship for whites only. As a result, the Irish became citizens, and through voting, they pursued an ethnic strategy in where they became elected to city councils and mayorships. Irish men then became hired as police officers and firemen, and by the 1900s, the Irish were entering middle class. According to Takaki, Jewish Americans were driven from the Middle Ages into the Anglo-American world beyond the Pale. In this country, they had settled in the Lower East Side, where there was tenements and factory garments that exploited many Jewish women. As for Mexican Americans, they were incorporated into the U.S. by the 1846 through 1848 war against Mexico. They did not come to this country as the border was moved when the U.S. annexed the Southwest. Significantly, most Mexican Americans today and in the early 20th century have immigrant roots in the journey to El Norte. Presently, many Mexicans are still crossing the border as they are experiencing poverty in Mexico and are pushed up north to the U.S. by employment opportunities. In this country, there are millions of illegal immigrants which are from Mexico. In 1979, Muslim Americans became refugees from Afghanistan after their country was invaded by the Russians. In 1989, after the Russian defeat, the Civil War broke out and ended with the superiority of the religiously conservative and oppressive Taliban. According to Takaki, as they were safe in America, the Afghan refugees were hardly noticed. However, on September 11, 2001, the terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon quickly changed their lives in this country. Muslims thereafter became judged, stereotyped, and viewed as terrorists to the American people. As most Afghan Americans sum up their challenges faced in this country, they know that a return to Afghanistan is not an option for their future, as they will have to change and make do in the U.S. As for Native Americans, they significantly contrast in that they did not undergo an immigrant experience. For thousands of years, Native Americans were in this country before the voyage of Columbus, which makes them longtime Americans. In 1607, English colonizers arrived as Native Americans were on the shores of Massachusetts and Virginia. The Indians had been farming the land for centuries until the English stereotyped them as savages and took away their lands by means of warfare. Thereafter, English military campaigns and their leaders against the native people were celebrated as heroes. In all summation, according to Takaki, 1993, he states, "The man from Europe is still a foreigner and an alien, and he still hates the man who questioned his path across the continent. The path was designed to create a white America. The revolutionaries of 1776 founded a white republic, which is a democracy that was not for all people."